kind of got to know Carol through her brother. He called and kind of said, "No, my sister is just an amazing quilter." We talked about Schweitzer Fest and things like that. So I contacted Carol, and I'm sure when some of us went up to the Bloomington show, we saw many of her things, but didn't know it at the time. So I contacted Carol and asked her if she would come and do a trunk show to kind of give us some inspiration on some of her work, and possibly get some ideas for some workshops from her. So Carol Henke, formerly from Tell City, is here with us today with some family members, and we welcome her, and we look forward to seeing your creations. And Carol now lives in Greenwood, so she made the trip down, and we're glad to have her. Welcome. Thank you.
I was born and raised in Tell City, and I learned to sew on my grandmother's treadle on Main Street. Does anybody remember the A&P?
Yeah.
Okay, she lived across the street from the A&P. And that's where I learned to sew, starting off with Barbie doll clothes and moving on. And I sewed my own clothes through high school, then moved to home deck, and then my daughter's clothes. And I've only been quilting about 11 years now. And so I kind of backed into it. I got 2 quilt tops when my aunt died. And I knew you could machine quilt them, and I took them to a quilt shop, and they said, "Oh, there's a 6-month wait." And I said, "I can sew, I can do this." So I took a class, and I started out learning to machine quilt. And that's literally, for the first couple of years, all I did was machine quilt. Because when people find out that you're a quilter, tops and blocks and stuff come out of the woodwork and show up at your house. So I was putting together quilt tops out of blocks other people had made, and maybe getting as exotic as a little sashing and some borders. So I wasn't piecing anything to speak of, and I still do not piece. I'm not a traditional cut it up little pieces and sew them back together. A 1/4-inch seam is okay. If I get it, I get it. If I don't, I don't. That's okay too. So I really have, and I don't, most of my stuff are all original designs. I'll tell you if I used a pattern. And we're going to start off with some family quilts. These are from Tell City, made, quilted, everything here. This is the oldest one, and this was done by my great-grandmother. It's a bit of a hybrid. She did these blocks, and the reproduction fabric was added probably in the 80s, but it was consistent with another quilt that she had done. The Little Pinks, I think they call the fabric. And so we do have that. She lived in a log cabin at Getchell, if you know where that is. Just past there, it was the Getchell post office. Then this one was actually made right on Main Street. This was my aunt and my grandmother made this one. It was one of the little kits that you could buy in the early 50s. This was actually my baby quilt. So it was done as a neutral because it was going to be a surprise what they had. And my aunt painted the little pussy willows on it, and it was hand quilted here. My grandmother pieced it. I don't know if my aunt could operate a sewing machine, but my grandmother could. She could look at a picture, look at you, and cut a pattern out of newspaper to fit you.
Wow.
is one of the tops that I inherited, that I started practicing. And I do all my quilting on a domestic machine. So this was done on a 5-inch deck. Little Brothers from Walmart. It's a stash quilt from, there's fabric as old as the 30s in this thing. The border was probably a 50s print, so I would think pattern is one name for it is Crown of Thorns. But this was made in Tell City. And this is my favorite pillowcase pattern to make, to go with these scrappy quilts. And I have done several different ones. I copied it off of an antique one, but I made them to match those type of quilts.
So, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, just
So you did the
machine quilting.
machine and quilted that on a regular machine.
Right.
I mean, how do you get all those curves with a regular machine?
Free motion, you drop your feed dogs,
Yeah.
and
Gosh, I
you
do
go
that,
any
but I
direction
can't
you
hardly-
want.
It's probably a lot of practice, cause I've tried that, it doesn't work well.
It was a lot of practice. I told you I spent 2 years doing nothing but quilting before I even did my own quilt top. Now this one was made and quilted in Tell City also. This was another one of the quilt kits that you could buy applique. The instructions said to use 1 strand of embroidery floss to sew these on. Can you imagine how thick and nasty that little fabric was? And that's what they were recommending you do. And it's called Poppies. The kit came in 2 waves. And I have an unfinished quilt kit that I've been working on for years now, that she started, and I'm going to finish, I hope, in my lifetime. When I started, I had always done handwork, and this was the first, I started making bags on the side between quilting, just for something to do. Well, this bag ended up so heavy, I really can't use it. But I also, every time I went to quilt shows, I used to make a bag to take to the quilt show. And I ended up stopping that because I kept getting stopped every time it wanted to take pictures. If you're familiar with Mondo bags, you can do designs. I made a watermelon. Here's one of my first bags to take to a quilt show. I actually was practicing my quilting. Every little block is quilted in a different pattern. And then it was getting boring just quilting, so I started doing trapunto. And all these eggs are padded on both sides. And then this is some of my favorite fabric. I think my sister was talking about, I have a sewing theme. She's wearing a very blinged out jacket that she made. And I have one that's sewing theme. And it has this fabric on the back of mine. But the patterns are all trapuntoed and vintage sewing theme. But the bags kind of are a fun thing I do just to kill time. Then once I ran out of quilt tops, I discovered that there's such a thing as panels. I could make up a quilt real quick by slapping some borders on, and then I could quilt it. And looks like I was practicing bubbling at the time. And this one is also trapuntoed, and it's done with metallic threads. Here is one of the first tops I ventured into, the jelly roll quilt. But they were kind of getting a little boring, so I put great big flowers and leaves on mine, so those are all big trapuntoed flowers throughout it, just to give it a little different look. But I made a lot of jelly roll quilts because I didn't have to cut anything up, and I didn't have to worry too much about the seams. Everything worked. Here, this will pass around. You can see some of the trapunto, and this was actually my first venture into kind of doing my own thing. This is my mother and her two sisters taken picture in Tell City about 1926. And so that was my base, and for some reason the printer they used turned this thing pink. And it's like, what am I going to do with the pink picture? It was supposed to have been sepia. And the class was for a pillow top, which was here, and I didn't need a pillow. So I went crazy on it. So
the jewels that you use, the jewelry, was that part of your family as well, or did you find those?
Actually, mine is all watch parts here because they grew up on the second floor of the jewelry shop that was there on Main Street. Their dad was a watchmaker, my grandfather. So this is all watch parts for that. Here is initials, pins of all kinds of family members. Your mom her M is on here. And in fact, a couple pieces are from Karen. And it's got all kinds of symbolism in it. There's a butterfly for my niece Tori. There's, I'd have to look close. It's got a mother on it. There's just all kinds of things that were put in it. And I don't believe there's too many rules. If you'll notice, this is needlepoint. Wool needlepoint is what these shoes are. This is pettit point. There's a pair of those. I did those years ago. This is my house numbers. There's an Indy 500 car on here because I'm from Greenwood, and that's what's, big time up there. My daughter's initial is on there. There's a lot of H's for my last name. It's been quite a few years since I made this, so I'm not sure. I'd have to really look at it to tell you what all's on there.
How did you attach some of those things?
Almost everything is sewn on except, almost everything I do is hand sewn, but there was one pendant that was from your mother that refused. It fell off so many times. It was too heavy and it kept cutting the thread. I glued it. And what I do use is jewel it. And I've had no trouble with it yellowing or anything coming off.
Where do you find that?
Hobby Lobby, Michael's, Joann's. Jewel it. And it's a very nice water-soluble glue while it's wet. But it dries permanent, you can wash it, and it holds this kind of type thing. If it oozes out a little, it dries clear, you don't see it. But I try to sew everything on by hand, and if I can't, I jewel it.
Okay, good.
So I know you said you started out with a smaller brother. What kind of machine did you do the jelly roll and everything else on?
My current machine is 10 year. In fact, I got a pair of them. It's a Janome 6500. It's got a 9-inch deck, and I got tired of one being in the shop, so I bought the second one just like it. So, and in fact, I have them at home in an L formation, so I can have a quilt on one, and I can sew a seam on the other. And I've got a featherweight, and the brother I had, the little Walmart brother, and I don't even want to think about what other machines I own. My husband doesn't need to know about them. Okay, I do occasionally use patterns, and this is a pattern, but I don't trust patterns. I found that every one of them got some problem in them. So if I'm using something that I really like, I will do a practice quilt, or I will make a baby quilt and use it as a quilting sample. And this one, I have some applique blocks that I wanted to use using this pattern, but I didn't trust the pattern, so I wanted to try it out. And there were a couple problems on the pattern, but it happens to be one of my favorite patterns. It was one of those where the fabric was found here and there, and it all worked together. This is the quilt I was making because I happen to like doing applique. I didn't bring a lot with me, but I like it. And it's one of my favorite combinations, purple and orange. And this one was a first place winner in one of the Indianapolis quilt shows.
What do you call it? What do you call it? The name of it?
I don't know. I make them up to write them up. It's probably called Asian Gardens or something along that lines. But I had bought the fabric years ago because I liked it and never knew what to do with it, and started making this applique.
Okay, the applique, is that all your own designs then that go around?
It's a combination. There's some of my stuff in there. It's some out of this book. It's modified out of that book. I'd have to really look to tell you what. Some of them are classic designs. I mean, and on each one is quilted with a different pattern, and each one has some insect quilted into the design. You'll find an inchworm or a butterfly or a spider or whatever on each one.
Now, when you machine quilt them, like, do you just say, oh, I'm gonna put the insect here, I'm gonna put the inchworm here, or do you kind of
On that,
draw a map out, or?
on that one, I probably would have at least taken a blue water erasable marker and generally lined what I was going to sew, because you have to do that when you're working around blocks and things. If I got a wide open space, I may go freehand.
Okay, when I try a machine quilt, my back always bunches up. How did you keep yours from doing that?
Okay, I would have, to start this quilt, I would have stitched in the ditch every place I could possibly find to stitch in the ditch. I went around every block, I went down every seam, so it is stable. So when I am quilting, I am only quilting this area. And I'm not moving my hands more than, 4 inches one way or the other. So each place is isolated, and you have, by doing the stitch in the ditch, you have stabilized all your areas.
So do you take the stitch in the ditch out then?
No.
Or leave it in?
It's in there.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see on some of them where it's just literally the stitch in the ditch is very obvious on some of them.
To base them first, do you pin them first?
I have a friend who has, I have hardwood floors, but I have a friend who has carpeted floors, so we pin them out on her floor, and I take the backing, and I T-pin it all around, I lay the padding on it, and the one thing I do is on my batting, I use 80-20, or I use wool. And I soak my battings in my wash machine in warm water and get them nice and wet and spin them out. I do not agitate, and then I put them in the dryer. So my backings are fluffier, so my quilt design shows up because I have pre-shrunk them. Oh, we were doing New York. This is a more recent one. A friend of mine, this is one I copied. A friend of mine came back with this panel from Paducah. Oh. And I loved it. So I made this one, and I made it in a different color wave. But I have a nephew who is in New York City, and at some point in time, one of these will be his, and one of them will be my brother's, who is his dad. So they will have something from New York for their place. The other one is, instead of the purple, the other one has a deep teal color. And they look like different quilts. Okay, now I have sisters who are enablers. And my sister in Tennessee, I have had poodles for 30, 40 years now. So she found this 1950s poodle Irish linen tea towel and gave it to me. So I had to quilt it, and it actually has the dog tags of some of my dogs as the decoration on it. And I have one now who has a basket just in front of my machine, and she sits on my machine looking out the front window, but she's highly offended by the mailman and anybody walking in front of our house. So she will hop out of her basket, and when 6 pounds hits your quilt, it stops you. So my quilts are not necessarily perfect because I may be suddenly stopped because she saw somebody walk by. Once I discovered panels, I also discovered that you can cut up panels. This is Stephanie Brandenburg. I happen to be a fan of hers. I like her colors and etc. You're going to see 2 quilts made with the same panel. In fact, the one quilt was supposed to have both panels in it, and I didn't like the pattern, and I modified it, and so I ended up with 2 quilts out of the same panel. They won't look anything alike, but you'll see them someplace in here. Okay, this happened to be a panel that I was kind of fond of, and it was based on a pattern, but I modified it. So I like also, if you see, I've got insects floating around on him.
take your insects off when you wash them or laundry them, or do you not?
I would if I did, but I mean, I don't have enough room to display most of my quilts, so most of them are in a closet or something. I do seasonal and I tend to bring them out seasonally, and so they are only displayed for a short period of time. And I think I've only got beds with okay, this is actually Tell City. My aunt was engaged by mail from a field hospital, actually a tent hospital in England, where he was injured during the Battle of the Bulge. And she worked on her trousseau. This was her days of the week dish towels. And this linen is so poor quality that you can come over and pick straws out of it. So I'm assuming she managed to buy it during World War II. And it was too poor quality to use for the military. Now I had to make 2 more blocks to have myself 9. But this and the original edge of this dish towel I cut off and used as my one of my borders. You can even see down here on this one where she had pulled the thread and was going to do a pulled thread little finish on them, and she never did get around to hemming them for some reason. So I found them in her sewing box after she was gone. So I mean, that's anybody that knew anything about it can't tell us. And I happened to save the other end of the linen just because I tend to do that. And I just made this a month or so ago. It's, again, the vintage linen, and it's kind of loosely based on my grandmother's 50s stand mixer. And I have some more, so I don't know what I'll do with it.
Did you hand applicate that, or?
Yes.
Okay, did you use any kind of a stiffening or anything on
No.
it? Just regular, okay,
Freezer paper
yeah.
is how I tend to do mine. And that's loosely based on, I'm in love with Pinterest. And
You can get anything out of Pinterest.
exactly, well, I tend to just look at pictures and make my own. So it's a modified version of a Lori Holt, I think. Okay, this was my first venture into art quilting. If I can get the top. My daughter designed this, and she was probably 8 or 9 at the time. And I literally thought I was quilting suns, and come to find out it was an underwater scene. I didn't know that. But this has got tulle over it, and it's the perfect season because that's Easter grass in there that's adding your sparkle. And it's metallic threads and
You passed for eclipse last year.
okay, well, this one is a wood block print that's from Guatemala or someplace, and I happened to find this perfect border fabric.
Oh my goodness.
And I trapuntoed the skirt so that the dancers are kind of flared out, and I used a serape for the back. I mean, I wouldn't want to get this near water, but it was fun.
Yeah.
Okay, here is another of the fairy panels. This one is trapuntoed, and I was starting to get into flanges and piping. So now you're gonna find piping on about everything I do, and flanges, and it's got Angeline fabrics or threads for their hair. The background is actually quilted in metallic, but it's pearl, so you don't really see it.
Where do you find your beautiful fabric?
Actually, I kind of shop, and I buy something I like, and then I carry it around with me till I find. I mean, these did not come together. They were bought two different places from two different manufacturers, and I just happened to go, and I mean, I literally, if I'm doing, you'll see some more intricate ones later, but I may collect for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
I've got a bag right now that I'm collecting. I'm doing an undersea one. That's anytime I find a fish or a shell, it goes thrown in that bag if the scale is right. Okay, here is some more of the Stephanie Brandenburg. This one is called After the Rain. And it was a pattern. It said to use 2 panels, but I didn't see why I needed to do 2 panels, and I did 1. So I have 2 quilts like this, just because I couldn't see cutting one little square out of another panel, and I changed it up a little. Okay, this one was at Bloomington, and it got an honorable mention. Now, this was years in the making. I would sit and bead on that in the evenings, and put it down and not pick it up for 6 months, and again I collected and I collected, and
So is that a panel?
it is a panel in the center. It's by Deb Strain. And I didn't even pick it out. It was given to me.
Oh,
And again, collected the fabric over the years that went with it. This folded flange is one of my favorite techniques. You're going to see it in a bigger scale a little later. But that's one of my favorite things of doing. But you always find a lot of handwork on my quilts. Okay, this one is a panel, but I was doing big into flanges. I was trying out one of the first time I did flanges, and I was practicing my echo quilting. So I would make panels and into tops just to practice a quilting technique. So this was fairly early in my thing. I don't use many panels anymore. And I also have a thing about sewing themed quilts. I kind of like them. This one is loosely based on a thing called Beyond the Block. Whoop, come on, get loose.
Just pins and
No.
Oh, working it, working. There it goes.
this flap on the side,
Oh,
unsnap it, it zips up.
oh, you're right.
Okay, it's got 3 working zippers on it. And back, you gave one. She gave me the big button that's on here someplace. Here, she
Oh,
found
yeah.
that in her searchings, and I had a place for it.
She says,
Now,
get quilting for her.
when you created that, did you already have in your mind what it was going to be? Did you draw it out? Or was it just you laid it on the floor and just started putting pieces together like I do?
I kind of tended to vaguely know I was going to have an angle. I knew I was going to put the zipper in because I wanted to see if I could still do a zipper. And it then, you know, I had maybe this corner in mind. And most quilt guilds are guilty of making me do this. You know, these quilt sayings, panels, what quilters say. Well, I bought one when I started out, and I made one of these little quilts up, and it turned out cute, and I gave it as a gift. So every time I went to a quilt guild quilt show, and they had one of these pitch out shops, somebody was selling one of these for $0.25 or 50 cents. And I thought, oh, that was cute. I'll make another one. Well, I kept throwing them in this tote bag every time I did it with my sewing theme fabric. And when I finally thought, well, I ought to make another one of those, I got in there. I had 12 of them. And so I've been challenging myself ever since to come up with different ways to put these quilt sayings into quilts. So this one was one. I may or may not have another one with me. I'm not sure. Yep, I do. Okay, this one is again another one of the quilt sayings, but I happened to run upon a piece of cross stitch. And then there's this wonderful quilt shop in Greensburg that if they don't have it, probably you're not going to find it. And it's got double piping here. It's got ruler ribbon around the edge of it. So it was just kind of a marriage of all kinds of things. This I've made since the start of the year. This I saw on Pinterest and I thought, I like that. But paper piecing is my least favorite thing to do, which is the needle portion down there. So I kind of modified her design. And I made it off a picture on Pinterest. And I thought that was just kind of fun. If I ever get a real sewing room, I'm going to put these all out. Okay, this one again is the quilt sayings. And I can't leave a plain border. So it's got piping, it's got embellishments, it's got beads, it's got everything.
Are your pins glued?
No, that's all hand, everything on this one is hand sewn on.
Yeah.
I have my mom's and my grandmother's sewing baskets. So I made this in honor of their sewing baskets, and this is literally items from their sewing baskets are on this.
And the strings are all tangled up, just like a real
Right.
sewing basket. At least
I mean, there's Cracker Jack toys on here. There's Barry Goldwater Vote for Me pin. There's, I mean, this. My daughter's great grandmother actually made this for her grandmother, and that's the quilt label inside the little hand crocheted basket thing. There's a needle book. I mean, those are real scissors on the edge. And a lot of people were giving me parts for from their mom's sewing basket that they didn't know what to do with. Okay, this. Is one of Stephanie Brandenburg's. The big panels, the ones she first came out with. And I trapuntoed the whole thing and embellished the centers and I mean, it's a pretty simple design. I mean, it for borders and etc. I think you can see on the back side where
That
the
is great.
flowers are done.
So is the circles on the backside, is that also part of the panel, or?
No,
did you cut-
those,
Okay,
I fussy cut those
Did you?
and out of another panel.
have another panel.
Well, actually yardage, it was yardage.
Mm-hmm.
And these are just fussy cut blocks that I cut out of piece I had left over. I made a purse and then pieced the black around them. Okay, this was my first kind of off the grid fabric choice. And it's a tablecloth that I thought was extremely gorgeous, and so I quilted it. Again, I was just trying to find stuff to quilt that I didn't have to cut up a bunch of little pieces to make. And it's done with metallic threads, it's beaded, it's got the hot fix crystals on it. And I have, some of my kitchen cabinets are painted fire engine red, so it looks great on the table in my kitchen. Then I happened to run across this tablecloth at, I had a few leftovers, so the sleeves decorated on the back. At a sale, and I just loved this tablecloth, and I didn't want it on my table. So this is that folded flange I was talking about with the buttons, and that is actually the vintage checkered tablecloth fabric. I had like a 1/4 of a yard piece of it, and that's what this is. Added to that, you've got rickrack and piping on the outside binding, and it's pretty much classified as a whole cloth. And that won at the last quilt show in Indy. Probably a lot of these have won. Okay, this was one of these that took me years to make because it was a matter of finding what I wanted to go with it. This is a vintage 40s tablecloth. And I happen to, if you'll notice, I like wide bindings, or wide, I actually like wide borders so I can do something with them. And this binding is almost it's 3/4 of an inch wide. If I'm going to put a stripe binding on bias cut, it's going to show. So, and there's no rules. Nobody has told me, oops, that's not a 2 1/4 inch binding. I have done a 3-inch binding so that my exposed was a whole inch before. But I took elements from the quilt, or from the tablecloth, and made the applique. The state of Florida is actually quilted following the basic design of a 50s road map, following the roads. So if you look at it, you'll see it's quilted like a road map would be. And then it's a little big. The bottom has got a travel trailer I took a few liberties with. It doesn't match exactly the ones that were on the tablecloth. But that little bit of beaded ocean there that you're seeing, that was 20 hours of beading.
Oh my goodness.
And then you've got over here the lounge chair with your lemonade and
Do you have dreams at night how to do these?
I will get inspirations, yes. Okay, this. I happen to like the kind of bright and bold designers. This one is Jane Sassman. I mean, it actually is fussy cut and pieced. If you've not done any of hers, she does some crazy quilts. But last year when I was in Paducah for the spring show, she was the featured at the museum. And wow. And I only own one. Nobody around here, my way carries her. So you don't get her too often. This is one of my spring quilts I display, but this is applique, and it's got all my little insect pins all over it. And it's just kind of a springy thing.
Do you ever order fabric off on the internet or anything like that?
I do, occasionally. If I've seen it and I can't get enough, I'm very picky about my colors, and I may not necessarily order a lot just because I'm a touchy-feely. But I'm not opposed to it in the slightest. If I know what it is, I'm all over it. Okay. I also happen to be a fan of wool applique. This is the first piece I took. This is, the center section was a class I took in the Indianapolis Quilt Show from Sue Spargo. And I didn't need another pillow, so I made it a little bigger. And this was pretty early on into my quilting. So, it's applique, metallic threads, the wool balls that were real popular there for a while that you can't find anywhere anymore. And this is my fall wool. All this is original design.
You have to keep that one away from the mice, right? Or is that
It
fabric?
actually has a little mice
Oh,
mouse
caterpillar.
peeking out
Oh.
of the
Pumpkin.
pumpkin over there. But, huh? I made it. It's all beadwork.
Oh, it
Oh.
Yeah.
I love that one.
Now this one was the last bigger quilt I did. And I got it done for the October Guild show, except I ran out of time and didn't get it was supposed to have a branch on the back that little squirrel and the leaves were attached to. And the quilt show deadline came before I got that sewed on there. So I still haven't got back to it yet. But this is, I call it, the working title was Crazy Birds, but it's called Tree of Life. And this bead fringe around the outside, it's actually like a pillow, you do it like a flange on a pillow. And I have several quilts that are finished with no binding whatsoever. And it weighs a ton. It was off some drapery that I got at Goodwill.
Oh, the birds were?
No, the bead
yeah,
trim.
the bead
I
trim,
bought the
okay.
draperies to get the bead trimming. So I could put it on this quilt. But it's got leather on it. This little bird down here. This is leather. Mother of pearl beading. This is stump work. On the little insects, you'll find them scattered around. I mean, there's cultured pearls on here. I mean, there's no telling what I put on it. I can't see to tell you what I have.
Was the background one piece of fabric or is
The
that
background was one piece of fabric, and I quilted it before I put all this stuff on it.
black? Oh.
And that was a pain appliquing in the center with all that bunched up. So,
I love his crown.
yeah, I thought he was pretty special. And this was a design as I go. I literally put one of my biggest, fondest quilting tools is Glad Press and Seal. If you don't use that, I mark my quilts for quilting designs on them a lot. But I took gold wrapping paper and I put press and seal on it, and then I would cut out my designs and audition them on the quilt to see the shape of my tree, the size of my bird, etc. So that was.
You said you've been quilting for 11 years,
Yes.
That's it?
and you've gotten all this.
This is probably only half of the hoard.
So what do you do on your spare time? Quilt.
I shop and yard sale.
She's good at that too.
Okay. Somehow this ended up on the other side, but I told you earlier there was a quilt that was 2 panels, same panels, 2 quilts. This is more or less the panel intact, but I added wool dimensional flowers in place of there. It's kind of loosely based on a pattern that went with the Stephanie Brandenburg, but it's not. And I liked her hydrangeas.
Do you make regular size bed quilts or just more wall hangers?
I started out on regular size quilts, and that's when I started. I thought the only thing you did with a quilt was you put it on a bed.
Right.
And if one of the quilt tops I got wasn't big enough to fit on a bed, I made it big enough to fit on a bed. I don't need any more bigger quilts. I mean, I do have a couple of kits around maybe that I may get to that are full size, and I know there's one I designed that I will get to. Since we have April, I brought my little Easter quilt and my April showers quilt. They're teeny. And here is another purse I made to go to a quilt show. And this is a spring wool I made, inspired by the hydrangeas color-wise that are next door to my dad's house on 9th Street. If you ever go by that house in the summer, you have got to see their purple hydrangeas. They're stunning. Okay, my mother collected handkerchiefs from the oldest one. I have a small trunk of her handkerchiefs. She never used them, you gifted them, and she kept them in the original envelope in the card that you gave them to her in. And so I actually know the dates on some of these, and I've kept the original tags and the envelope that it went with, so it will eventually go with the quilt. So I have a large selection of handkerchiefs, and I've added to it. So I have lots of handkerchiefs. This was my first venture into
You need some help holding that?
handkerchiefs.
Oh. Here. Now you can get in front and talk about it.
This is, if you can Google this pattern, it's called origami dresses. It's for paper folding. And it's taking a square of paper and folding it into this shape, and they got great Google tutorials on it. And I did that. So this was the quilt I made, just, to do it. It's got probably 8 or 10 layers of fabric out here in this border, because it's got piping, it's got lace, it's got the binding, and it was a fun thing. If you look at each dress, they all have buttons, they've got bows, they've all got little rose corsages, they've all got belts. And those actually are not my mother's handkerchiefs, because I didn't know what I was doing, so I wasn't, touching her stash yet. Where'd I put them? Thank you. Okay, now this was my mother's. In the 40s, when you wore that hot red lipstick, you didn't want to get that on your nice white handkerchiefs, so you had red blotter handkerchiefs so you blew your nose, your red lipstick didn't stain them, but she never used them. And this literally is the those came out of her little trunk. So did the one on the back with her initial on it. But I was out shopping at a quilt shop and ran across this fabric and went, I know what to do with this. This fabric, I also own it in 2 other colors. I liked it so much. So I've got, you're gonna see some other quilts coming down the road. I've got one navy blue with hot pink, and it's got major plans. It's gonna be a bigger thing than this little thing, but I happen to own the little lipstick pen. In fact, last night when we were going through some of my mom's stuff, we found a lipstick shaped pen that's going to be the hanger for this quilt, if I ever find where it's going. But I started out trying to make maybe something a little more modern that the grandkids might appreciate the handkerchiefs with. I don't know if they're going to get that yet. Okay, this one literally, I just finished quilting, but it's going to have watch parts and crystals that come all down the side. Ken Rowland at Rowland's Jewelry has hooked me up, so I'm going to, in fact, we need to keep this out and not pack it because it's got to go just so Ken can see it in live. Now that we found the parts, which were in another bag, we can put them together. But that is a vintage handkerchief. And some of the handkerchiefs I collected down along the line weren't in the best shape. And this is the little bits and pieces of the pretty embroidery that had holes in it, but what are you going to do with it? Mondo bag pressed to a foundation, so, and you recognize the fabric is left over from this quilt. My top production has got in front of my quilting, so I have not got these quilted, but they were, any place I happen to be, people have been really interested in, so I brought them unquilted, which I've never, first trunk show I've been out with unquilted quilts. These are my mother's handkerchiefs. They're all uncut. They were never used. They had the original labels on them. This one was in an envelope dated 1946, and I mean, back then you could write her name. Her name was written on some of these, and it said city.
City.
But these all have little necklaces. They're going to have little crystal butterfly pins on them. I haven't added. They do not have their petticoats yet because I have to be able to flip them up to quilt. And I'll tell you what I'm doing underneath of them. About a ½ inch up, it's going to say ooh la la or stop it, because everybody's going to flip them. So it's going to have something written under each one.
Or my seamstress.
Yeah. So, and I'm doing these so when the grandkids get old enough, and if they have girls, we're going there with them. Now this quilt, if you ever look on Pinterest and type in handkerchief dresses, you're going to get some of these pop up. I literally get pinned on this thing, and I don't know how I managed to post this picture. I'm not very good at that, so it somehow I hit something and this picture of one of these blocks popped up on Pinterest. And these are all my mother's. It's probably not the best shape at the moment, but her favorite flowers were the violets that grew in your yard. In fact, that was on her wedding cake. These haven't traveled as well as they should, but they're just pinned on again because I need to flip them to sew under them. Vintage doilies to fill in the places. And this one has angel wings because she's passed. And but those were all her handkerchiefs. They're all violets. And this fabric, I had it in my stash, and I had about that much left over. I mean, this lace is on here to hide the little pokey holes on the selvage I had to put on there. And I have purple crystals once it's quilted, that each one of these little flowers will have a purple crystal on it. So this hasn't even been blinged out yet. And then we'll finish up with what I literally took off my machine to bring down here. I mean, I was quilting this yesterday. You were interested in thread painting. My little poodle, Sophie, likes to be covered up in her basket, so anytime I find poodle fabric, she gets a new little quilt. So she's got about 3 or 4 little quilts that go on her, and I thread painted the little poodle based on the fabric there. Then
What is thread painting? What is that?
you'll see on a black one in a minute. This is another thread painted, all the hair. My daughter did this one. It's the only time that she's ever listened to every word I told her to do. I had to literally change the thread for her every time she wanted to change colors. But she is a real pro at thread painting. And you can do 2 different, densely quilted, lightly quilted. The secret is you do them separately and put them together. Okay, now this one I think you're going to be able to see. This is not done because I took it off my machine to bring. This is thread painted. And literally you're painting your design with thread. This happened to be a silk scarf I bought that I decided I was never going to wear, and thought I'd try the thread painting. But it's been years in the making because it takes a long time. And that pretty much is all I brought. So anybody got any questions?
20 questions.
I tend to quilt during the day when I've got natural light in this, and I do my hand sewing at night while I watch television.
Have you ever seen a butterfly quilt made out of your hankies?
I have.
I've got a pattern. I've probably got 50 of those old-fashioned hankies at home. I just had a lady the other day give me 20. I was at her house and she goes, "You want these?" And I'm going, "Yeah."
Stuff comes to you.
Yeah. I didn't.
I was thinking about making a butterfly, but man, I don't know. You might have changed my mind.
Yeah.
Well, these patterns actually will be available this summer. And my daughter's in graduate school, and I'm kind of I don't do much with the computer, so she needs some free time to put them on the computer, and they will be available. They're all.
I love the violets because that's my name.
Oh, yeah. And I happen to have 13 violet handkerchiefs, and I've since acquired a 14th, but 13 that were my mom's, so that's how big this was, because that's what fit, and that's how much material I had.
Yeah, I was getting ready to ask you where you found your material, and you said you got it out of your stash. So.
I did. It was somebody's flower of the month. In the early 2000s, late 2009, one of them, Norcott maybe, did a flower of the month. And I actually have this, and I have the gladolias, because I have my aunt's unfinished gladolia applique quilt, and that's the backing. But I acquired it someplace in my travels and thought it was pretty and bought it.
So that quilt with the violets is the one that has like the lace doilies on it?
Mhm.
Are they crocheted like?
Hand
So-
crochet.
So you just, you attach them to the quilt and then you quilt over those? When you quilt it?
In fact, they're not very sewed on right now,
Would you?
because I'm going to quilt over them.
Right.
Now, if you have trouble and you catch your foot or anything, you put press and seal over them and you quilt. But my foot I have stopped the hopping on my foot. I don't let it hop anymore. And so I just sew on these things. And it's, when you first sew them on here and here, you shorten your stitch length way down. And then you can, there's one thing about this quilt, you can turn it over and you can see where I've tacked them on. They are literally quilted, kind of stitching the ditch onto it with free motion. Just onto the fabric, but they will get a lot more quilting down the road. But you don't do anything fancy in them because you can't see it.
Right.
You just want them on there and down. And it's a waste of time to do anything that is of any, because it disappears. These will probably be quilted, I'm kind of thinking feathers, but I haven't got there yet. It's one of those, I'll sit down and draw and start, and but the doilies will just probably be stippled or something on, not anything heavy duty.
Was the doily a big doily that you cut
It
into
was.
the 4 pieces?
There was, and this one was, well, that's 1/4 of it.
Wow. Then what did you
It's-
do to
it's-
keep it from rattling? Did you put something on it, on the edges?
You literally, when you cut it, you do it right beside your fabric and you sew it on. Just cut it and then I sewed it, and I reduced my stitch length real low, to real small, so that I'm sewing it on just around the 2 edges.
I made one with a doily, and what I did, I literally sewed mine like right down like a deer, and that way, and then I cut in between them.
Okay.
That way I did.
I found that I did this before I put the blocks together, so all I had to do was a little square or triangle of fabric, so I sewed it on before I attached it, so I then did the top stitching right down each side and loosely tacked it on so it was ready to go right now. Then this one actually I didn't, was a wonky one, and I ended up having another section left that I put on another quilt because I wasn't going to throw it away. And so I needed 2 different looks because I had 2 different places to fill in. Since I was dealing with dresses, I could not, there wasn't anything I could make to go in there, and I didn't have any handkerchiefs that I wanted to cut up. The one thing about these, none of these handkerchiefs have been cut.
Yeah.
They're all strictly folded.
That's great.
Which is perfect for the way your mom kept them.
Yeah, so if anybody ever, for some reason, wants them again, you can get them.
You mentioned you did a workshop before coming here. What workshop was that?
The one that's the beginning, I've got an advanced, but the beginning one is because the time is usually 2.5 hours, is I make a little, have you make a little teacup pin cushion. And you do dimensional flower, wool flowers, beading, sequining, and we do some lace work. And it's not very intimidating because you don't have to do a piece bigger than this. Most people are able to finish it or almost get it finished within that time period. And I brought quilts, as you can see, some of the same techniques I have. I mean, anybody can put 3 sequins and 10 beads on. And, I mean, you may not be wanting to do a whole quilt like I did with it, but you can pop a bead or crystal here or there and go for it. Okay, well, it's been nice.
Thank you.
Tell us about that wrinkle release thing. That was
Okay.
news to me, so I don't know if somebody else might not know about it.
I brought this because these quilts have been folded up for several days, and I meant to last night pull these tops out and spray them so they would look a little better when I brought them, but I forgot to do it. But if you don't know about wrinkle release, you buy, this happened to came from Dollar General, $1.50. You take your wrinkled clothes, you spray them. I usually hang them on a hanger, just spray both sides. Go fit, get dressed. By the time I come back, the wrinkles are gone. Beats ironing. My iron only does quilts.
I have to buy my daughter little stuff like that. But I tell you, she's never irons anything. She didn't even iron, and I finally got her one. She goes, "What's that?"
Wrinkle release. Get her a case.
I'm full of case.
It doesn't stain your quilts or anything, does it?
No.
Just
I don't know what it is. I mean, I have used it on expensive clothes. You know, especially when you change seasons, which I hope to be able to do sometime soon.
Great to travel with.
Yeah, and so I pull something out that I haven't worn for a while, and it's got crushed. I keep it in my closet right handy, so I'm ready to go.
Can you take one of those smaller wall hanging quilts and show me how you folded that?
Yeah.
Because they came with,
They're all bias folded.
Okay.
I have to dig a minute to get some.
I'm sorry.
Here, we'll do this one. Okay, if you want your quilts not to have wrinkles and to store them, you want to do a bias fold on them. And that's how I got all these quilts in those few bags. They'll not go back in unless we would refold them that way. Okay, your bias fold is you're keeping your fabric on the grain. You take one corner, bring it up and in. So this one, you know, you kind of line it up with your border. So you're literally, you have that.
Okay.
Then your next fold is to the other one. And at this point, you reach under and you grab your other, because if you want it smaller folds, you roll this way, and then you go that way. So everything is on the bias. And these quilts have been sitting in that suitcase for days. And then your next step is to fold in and fold in. Every fold is on a bias here, so that you're not getting the center crease lines. And then you do that, and you have a bias folded quilt. And that's the recommended way to store them if you've got to fold them. I mean, ideally they want them rolled up on a tube, but who has that kind of space?
So you could put that on YouTube, right? Can we watch that?
It's out there. It's not an idea I ever came up with.
I saw that.
I gotta go refold all my quilts now.
Yeah. And they will take up a smaller space. It actually allows you to put more in, and then when you unfold them, you don't get the crease lines.
Yeah.
That'd be a good way to hang them on a quilt rack too, if you fold them on a bias, because then you could pretty much control how much.
If they're quilted enough, yeah.
Right.
Once they're quilted, you could easily fold them on bias and hang them. But,
You even do that with your, like the wool and the autumn ones. Do you fold that on a bias too?
that one will not fold on the bias because those center blocks are too dense. It literally folds in four, and that's all it folds.
Yeah.
In fact, I had to take it to put that in a quilt show. I had to make a bag because it wouldn't fit in a standard pillowcase. I made a bag to custom fit that quilt in because it only folded that in four.
Where do you start off with the home?
My daughter moved out, and I got her back.
Yeah, that's always a blessing.
Yeah.
I have another room now.
Her closet at the moment holds all of my quilts, but one side has some hanging clothes in it, you know, my funeral clothes and stuff. But they may have to go.
We bought furniture for it too.
Oh yeah, we've added to the furniture to hold the bar quilts. So I've been trying to kind of downsize some of my quilts, but.
So will that room be your proper sewing room now?
No, actually, I had a formal living room and a family room. I now quilt in front of my picture window in my formal living room. You walk into the disaster of my stowing room.
It's fabulous. You've got more stuff in there than carton
Yes.
little liver pills, and it's all great.
So, yeah, 3 machines out right in that room alone. My 2 Genomes and my featherweight. And if you don't know, my brother owns Hauenstein's Clothing downtown. In fact, that's where we're heading next because we're taking the watch kit or quilt to Ken Rowland.
Okay, your last name was Henke. Are you related to Martha and Frank Henke any, or no? That's no relation.
My husband's side of the family was the only son of the only son of the only son. But we kind of think that most of them came before the Civil War to Logansport, Indiana, because that's where they're all from. So I think back in the late 1840s, 1850s, they came over all together as cousins and brothers and stuff. Because most of them, if they trace back, that's where they ended up. So it may have been a whole town. We don't know. Nobody's alive to tell us much about that anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. You're very talented.
gotta fold all these.
I brought extra of the blue things. In fact, if you guys haven't discovered these things, the Ziploc giant bags.
Oh, is that what that is?
Yeah. I brought extra because unless I refold all these quilts on bias, they're not going back into the bags. But these things are strong enough to do quilts. In fact, sometimes I do the little collapsible wagons, and I stand 4 of these up in there with the quilts. Depends, you know, if I have help or I don't have help. These I can lift, those big suitcases are a little trying to get out of my trunk. So, that's what I use.
Get somewhere else.